They say you find out who really loves you when you're lying in a hospital bed alone. I found out from 20 feet up on a scaffold when my leg snapped like a dry twig. The fall happened fast. 40 years in construction, and I'd never been careless. But that morning, a loose bolt, a wet plank, gravity did the rest. Pain wasn't my shattered leg. It was the silence from my phone. I called my son Brandon 7 times from that hospital bed. 7 times, the line rang until his voicemail clicked on. "Hey, it's Brandon. Leave a message." I did. Every single time. "Son, it's Dad. Had an accident. I'm at Mercy Hospital in Pittsburgh. Room 214. Could use some company." My voice cracked on the last one. I hung up and stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the stains while Nes changed shifts around me. By the 3rd day, I stopped calling. The orthopedic surgeon said I'd need 6 weeks in a cast, maybe physical therapy after. "You got family to help at home, Mr. Paterso?" I nodded. Lied. Signed my own discharge papers on day 3 and hobbled to my truck on crutches, my right leg in a blue fiberglass cast up to my knee. The drive home took twice as long. Every brake pedal pump sent lightning up my shin. I pulled into my driveway in Shaler Township just as the sun dipped below the oak trees, casting long shadows across the lawn I hadn't mowed in 2 weeks. Inside, the house felt colder than usual. I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter, poured a glass of water, and sat heavily in my recliner. That's when I made the mistake of opening Facebook. Brandon's face filled my screen. Tanned. Smiling. Standing on a yacht deck with a champagne flute raised high. Beside him, Dylan Shaw, my ex-wife's new husband, arm draped over Brandon's shoulder like they were posing for a father-son catalog. The location tag read Malibu, California. The caption punched harder than the fall. Learning what real success looks like from the best mentor a guy could SK4. Grateful for the wisdom. #blessed. #dad goals. Dad goals. I zoomed in on that hashtag until the pixels blurred. My son, 32 years old, calling another man dad while I sat alone with a broken leg and 7 unanswered voicemails. I didn't cry often. And since my own father's funeral back in '93. But sitting there in the dim light of my living room, staring at that photo, something cracked deeper than bone. I let one tear fall. Just one. Then I wiped it away and made myself a promise. That was the last time I'd cry over Brandon Peterson. The next time tears were shed in this family, they wouldn't be mine. I pushed myself up, crutches squeaking on the hardwood floor, and limped to the garage. In the back corner, covered in a tarp and 10 years of dust, sat something I hadn't looked at in a long time. I pulled the tarp off slowly. A wooden toolbox. Small, crude, uneven edges. The kind a child makes when he's learning. Brandon had built it when he was 8 years old, right here in this garage, with my hands guiding his on the saw. He'd carved his name into the lid. Brandon Peterson. Age 8. My dad taught me. I ran my fingers over the carving, feeling the grooves. Back then, he'd looked up at me like I hung the moon. "Dad, you can build anything," he'd said, eyes wide with wonder. I'd ruffled his hair. "Omde, you will too, son. Measure twice, cut once. That's the secret." He'd remembered the box. Kept it through college, through 3 apartments, through every move. But he'd forgotten the lesson. Forgotten the man who taught him. Forgotten everything except Dylan's yak. And #dad goals. I set the toolbox on my workbench and opened my file cabinet with shaking hands. Inside were 15 years of records. Bank statements showing monthly transfers. 2,000 here. 5,000 there. The deed to Brandon's house, a 3-bedroom Craftsman in Lawrenceville, my name still on the title because I'd co-signed when his credit wasn't good enough. The title to his car, a 2019 BMW, purchased outright with a cashier's check from my savings account. Receipts for his college tuition. His failed business startup. His engagement ring to a girl who left him anyway. I pulled out my calculator and started adding. Line by line. Year by year. The numbers climbed. 50,000. 100,000. 200,000. When I finally hit total, the display read T. $382,470. 38 years I'd swung hammers in Pittsburgh heat and Pittsburgh snow. Lived in this same small house. Drove trucks until the odometers rolled over. Saved every spare penny. Built my son a Safet. Why net so he'd never fall as hard as I once did. He'd used it as a hammock. I picked up my phone. My hands didn't shake anymore. I scrolled through contacts and pressed call. A woman answered on the second ring. Tom's law office, how can I help you? I need an appointment with Tom, I said. My voice steady as a plumb line. Today if possible. It's about asset recovery. She paused. Mr. Peterson. Tom's been your friend for 20 years. He'll make time. 4 o'clock work, perfect, I said. I hung up and looked at the pile of documents spread across my desk. Deeds. Titles. Bank records. Proof of everything I'd given. Everything I'd built. Everything I was about to take back. I wasn't going to yell. Wasn't going to beg. I was going to teach my son what I should have taught him 30 years ago. Nothing in life is free. Not even a father's love. And when you forget where you came from, sometimes you need to lose everything to remember. The appointment was in 3 hours. I had work to do. Tom's office sat on the 5th floor of a brick building downtown, the kind Pittsburgh built back when steel was king and handshakes meant something. I took the elevator up, my crutches awkward in the tight space, and pushed through the frosted glass door at exactly 4 o'clock. Tom looked up from his desk, reading glasses perched on his nose, gray hair combed neat. He'd been my lawyer for 20 years, handled my divorce, my will, every contract I'd ever signed. But he'd never seen me like this. Frank, he said, standing up. Heard about the accident. You all right? I dropped the stack of files on his desk with a thud that rattled his coffee mug. I need to reclaim everything, Tom. The house. The car. Every dollar I can legally take back. And I need it started, Todd. He sat back down slowly, opened the first folder, and started reading. The deed to Brandon's house, my name co-signed. The BMW title, purchased outright in my name, transferred to Brandon as a gift. Bank statements highlighted in yellow, 15 years of transfers totaling over $380,000. Tom flipped through page after page, his expression shifting from surprise to unday. We're standing. Legally, you're covered, he said finally. Your name's on the titles. The transfers were gifts, not loans, but you retain ownership rights on the properties. We can file for asset reclamation, initiate eviction proceedings, repossess the vehicle. But Frank, he looked up, his eyes serious, this is your son. Was, I said. My son answered when I called. Tom nodded once. Fair enough. He pulled out a yellow legal pad and started writing. I'll draft the paperwork tonight. Eviction notice, asset seizure, cease and desist letters. We'll send them certify. Mail by tomorrow morning. He paused, tapping his pen. But there's something else you should know about Dylan Shaw. He turned his computer monitor toward me. Pulled up public records. Dylan's real estate development company, Shaw Properties LLC. Tax liens from 2020. Overdue payments to contractors. Inflated expense deductions flagged by the IRS 3 years running. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to paint a picture. He's been skating on thin ice for years, Tom said. One good audit, and he's done that. I leaned forward. How do we trigger an audit? Tom raised an eyebrow. Officially? We don't. Unofficially? Anonymous tip to the IRS. They love investigating guys like Dylan. Flashy cars, offshore accounts, questionable write-offs. He slid a Business card across the desk. IRS whistleblower hotline. You didn't get this from me. I pocketed the card. What about blowback? Dylan's got money, connections. He'll threaten lawsuits, Tom said. Harassment, elder abuse, undue influence. But we've got paper trails. You supported Brandon his entire adult life. Documented, dated, verified. Dylan's threats are OTR. Let him bring lawyers. We'll bury him in evidence. A memory flashed. 6 years ago, Ann's backyard barbecue. Dylan in a polo shirt and loafers, arm around Brandon, holding court like a TED Talk speaker. Your dad's good with hammers, kid, Dylan had ID loud enough for me to hear. But I build empires. Brandon had laughed. I'd stood by the grill, flipping burgers nobody thanked me for, writing a check later that week for Brandon's rent. I blinked back to the present. Do it, I said. All of it. Eviction, repossession, IRS tip. I want everything filed by tomorrow. Tom nodded and started typing. This'll get ugly, Frank. It's been ugly for years, I said. I was just too blind to see it. I left his office an hour later with a folder full of drafted documents. Preliminary eviction notice. Vehicle repossession authorization. Asset reclamation petition. And tucked in the back, a printed copy of the IRS Form 3949A, information referral. All I had to do was fill in Dylan's details and mail it. But a lawyer wasn't enough. I needed numbers. I needed to make sure every dollar was accounted for, every loophole closed. I drove across town to Ellen's accounting office, a small suite in a strip mall. LL near the waterfront. She'd handled my taxes for 15 years, knew every cent I'd ever earned or spent. Ellen looked up from her desk when I walked in, her sharp eyes taking in my crutches and the folder under my arm. Roy, she said. You look like a man on a mission. I am, I said, sitting down heavily. I need you to find everything. Every transfer to Brandon. Every gift. Every payment. And then I need you to look into Dylan Shaw's businesses. Tax filings, LLC stro. Tours, anything that doesn't add up. She adjusted her glasses and opened her laptop. This about Brandon, this is about teaching my son what I should have taught him years ago. I can't do that if Dylan's whispering in his ear. Ellen's fingers flew across the keyboard. Give me an hour. 60 minutes later, she slid a printed report across her desk. Your financials are clean. No joint accounts with Brandon, no shared liabilities. You're bulletproof. But Dylan? She tapped the second S. Tack of papers. His company's a mess. Misclassified employees to dodge payroll tax. Offshore LLC in the Caymans. Deductions for personal expenses written off as business. The IRS would have a field day. Why? Can you file a tip? I asked that. She smiled. Already drafted. Anonymous, untraceable. Say the word, and I'll submit it tonight. I looked at the evidence. Years of Dylan's arrogance, his shortcuts, his smug smile. The empire he'd built on sand. Send it, I said. Ellen hit submit. The screen flashed confirmation. Done. I drove home along the Allegheny River as the sun set, painting the water orange and gold. My phone buzzed with an email from Tom. Documents filed. Certified mail sent. Eviction proceedings initiated. It started, Frank. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the truck for a long moment, engine ticking as it cooled. The house was dark. Empty. Quiet. But for the first time in 3 days, I felt something other than pain. I felt purpose. Tomorrow, Brandon would get the letters. Tomorrow, Dylan would hear from the IRS. Tomorrow, the foundation I'd built for my son would crumble. And maybe, just maybe, he'd finally learn to build his own. The email arrived at 7:43 the next morning. I was pouring my second cup of coffee when my laptop pinged, the sound cutting through the quiet kitchen like a warning shot. The sender's name made me pause mid-pour. Dylan Shaw. Subject line, all caps. Cease your interference immediately. I set the coffee pot down and clicked open. Roy, you've crossed a line. Whatever vendetta you're nursing, it ends now. I've consulted with my attorneys regarding your harassment of Brandon and your malicious interference with my business in Tier. STS. If you proceed with this eviction nonsense or continue spreading false information to federal agencies, I will pursue every legal remedy available. Harassment. Defamation. Tortious interference. Elder abuse claims if necessary. Brandon is family. You're destroying him out of spite and jealousy. Withdraw your filings by 5 p.m. today, or face consequences you can't afford. I read it twice. Then I clicked reply and typed 4 words. See you in court. My finger hovered over send. Then I added one more line. Bring receipts. I hit send and took a long sip of coffee. It was still hot. Tasted like victory. My phone rang 17 minutes later. Dylan's name flashed on the screen. I let it ring 3 times before answering, putting it on speaker, setting it on the kitchen table. You senile old fool, Dylan's voice exploded through the speaker, sharp and furious. You think you can touch me? You're a retired construction worker living in a house worth maybe 200 grand. I've got properties in 4 states and lawyers on retainer who eat guys like you for breakfast. I'm not touching you, Dylan, I said calmly, sitting down. I'm reclaiming what's mine. There's a difference. Brandon doesn't deserve this, Dylan snapped. He's building a future. Trying to make something of himself. You're just bitter because and chose better. Admit it. I felt the barb, designed to wound. But I'd had 3 days to build scar tissue. Chose better, I repeated. Is that what you tell yourself? She chose money. You chose control. I chose my son. Spent Rudy years proving it with every paycheck. Oh please, Dylan laughed, harsh and grating. You didn't choose him. You smothered him. He came to me because I showed him what real success looks like. Not your blue-collar, lunch pail, 9 to 5 m. Mediocrity. Real success, I said. That what you call those tax liens? Those offshore accounts the IRS is suddenly very interested in. Silence. 3 full seconds of it. Then his voice dropped, low and dangerous. You sent that tip. Truth hurts, doesn't it? I said. All those business expenses. The boats. The trips to Malibu. Creative accounting. The IRS loves creative guys like you, Dylan. You'll regret this, he hissed. I'm coming over. We're settling this face to face. The line went dead. I sat back and finished my coffee. 22 minutes later, headlights swept across my front windows. A black Mercedes SUV, polished and gleaming, pulled into my driveway like an invading army. The engine cut. The door slammed. Heavy footsteps on my porch. Dylan didn't knock. He pounded. I took my time getting up, crutches squeaking on the floor. Opened the door with the chain still latched. Dylan stood under the porch light, dressed in a tailored suit despite the early hour, his face flushed red. "Take the chain off," he demanded. "No," I said. He shoved against the door. It held. "Fine. We'll talk like this. You want to play hardball, old man? Let's play. I'll bury you in emotions. Drag this out for years. Cost you every penny you've saved." "I've got time," I said. "I'm retired. How's your cash flow looking these days?" His jaw clenched. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a leather checkbook, and started writing. The pen scratched violently. He tore the check free and held it up to the gap in the door. $100,000. Sign an NDA. Stop the audit tip. Withdraw the eviction. Walk away. I unlatched the chain and opened the door fully. Dylan's eyes widened slightly, surprised. I stepped onto the porch, crutches and all, and took the check from his hand. Looked at it. 100,000. And then no cents. His signature, bold and arrogant. I tore it in half. Then in half again. Let the pieces flutter to the porch like snow. "You can't buy principles, Dylan," I said quietly. His face went purple. "Principles? You're jealous. And chose me. Brandon chose me. Because you're nothing. A hammer swinger playing grown-up in a world you don't understand." I stepped closer. Close enough to smell his cologne, expensive and cloying. When I spoke, my voice was low, steady, and colder than any Pittsburgh winter. "I swing hammers, Dylan. Built half the buildings in this city. Put roofs over families' heads. You swing lies. Built your life on credit and cons and other people's money. Let's see which found that. Ion breaks first. Brandon will hate you forever," he spat. "Maybe," I said. "But he'll respect me. He'll forget you like a bad investment. Give it 6 months." Dylan's hands clenched into fists. For a moment, I thought he might actually swing. But he was a coward under the expensive suit. He turned, stormed down the steps, and climbed into his Mercedes. The engine roared. Tires screeched as he reversed out of my driveway, leaving rubber marks on the asphalt. I watched his taillights disappear down the street. Then I picked up the torn pieces of the check and threw them in the trash. The house settled into silence again. I sat in my recliner, leg propped up, and waited. Dylan was right about one thing. Brandon would hate me. And right on cue, 36 hours later, the pounding came again. Different this time. Desperate. Furious. I opened the door. Brandon stood there, wild-eyed, unshaven, clutching papers in his shaking hand. The eviction notice. The car repossession order. "You're destroying me," he shouted, shoving the papers at my chest. "My house. My car. Everything. Dylan's right. You're just bitter and jealous and pathetic. Where are you staying?" I asked calmly. "His guest house," Brandon snapped. "Because he's family. More than you ever were." I nodded slowly. "Good. Enjoy it while it lasts. What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," I said, "that Dylan's world is collapsing too. And when it does, you'll be the first thing he throws overboard." "You're insane," Brandon yelled. "I'm getting a lawyer. I'll fight this. I'll take everything you have left that you don't have anything to take, son, I said. I made sure of that years ago. He stared at me, breathing hard. Then turned and stormed off. No car to drive away in. Just walked down the street, shoulders hunched, papers crumpled in his fist that I closed the door. 3 days, I thought. Maybe 4. That's how long Dylan would keep him. And then the real lesson would begin that I didn't hear from Brandon for 5 days. But I heard about him. Day 1, Sarah called. Dad, there's a moving truck at Brandon's house. They're putting everything on the curb. I know, I said. Day 2, my neighbor Ted stopped by. Saw your boy's BMW getting towed this morning. Off a very nice driveway in Fox Chapel. Dylan Shaw's place, if I'm not mistaken. Everything okay? It will be, I told him. Day 3, the news broke. Local business reporter, 3-minute segment on the evening broadcast. I watched it on my laptop while eating leftover meatloaf. Prominent developer Dylan Shaw facing IRS audit. Multiple properties under review. Clients distancing themselves amid allegations of financial irregularities. The camera panned across Dylan's office building as federal agents carried out boxes. I turned it off and washed my dish. Day 4, Sarah sent a text with a photo. Brandon's belongings, black trash bags and cardboard boxes, piled outside Dylan's security gate. The gate was closed. A handwritten sign taped to it. No trespassing. Day 5, Sarah called again. Her voice was softer this time. Dad, he's sleeping in his car. Well, not his car. He doesn't have one. He's been sleeping on Mike's couch. Mike, my old foreman. Retired 3 years ago after 42 years pouring concrete. Good man. Big heart. That Mike's a saint, I said. Mike says Brandon just sits there, Sarah continued. Won't talk much. Applied for a stocking job at Walmart yesterday. They turned him down. No retail experience. Good, I said. Dad, Sarah's voice cracked slightly. Honey, I said gently. He needs to fall all the way down before he can stand back up. If I catch him now, he'll never learn. She was quiet for a moment. I know, she finally said. But it's hard to watch. It's harder to live, I said. Trust me. That afternoon, I drove past the construction site where I'd worked for 30 years. Peterson and Sons Commercial Builders. No relation, despite the name. I'd always thought maybe one day Brandon LD make it true. I parked across the street, engine idling. And there he was. Brandon sat on the curb, hunched over, elbows on his knees. His clothes were wrinkled. Beard growing in patchy. He wasn't doing anything. Just watching the crew work. Watching them measure. Cut. Build. The way I'd done for nearly 4 decades. As I watched, Mike emerged from the site trailer, carrying 2 paper bags. He walked over to Brandon and sat down beside him. Handed him one of the bags. A sandwich, probably. Mike always brought extra. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I knew Mike. He was telling stories. I could see his hands gesturing toward the building, toward the steel beams, toward the foundation. Mike had worked Bayside to me for 26 years. He knew every sacrifice I'd made. Every double shift. Every winter I'd worked through bronchitis because Brandon needed braces or baseball camp or college textbooks. Brandon's shoulders started shaking. That he was crying. That I gripped the steering wheel tighter. My instinct, the father instinct, screamed at me to get out. To walk over there. To fix it. But I didn't. Because Mike was right. Some lessons, you can't teach. You can only let life deliver them. That I put the truck in gear and drove away. 3 more days passed. Quiet ones. I worked on small projects in my garage. Sanded down an old chair. Fixed the porch railing. Kept my hands busy so my mind wouldn't wander. Then, on the 8th day, just after sunset, I heard a soft knock on my front door. Tentative. Almost apologetic that I set down my coffee and walked to the door. Looked through the peephole. Brandon stood on my porch. He looked thinner. Tired. His eyes were red-rimmed. And in his hands, he held something I hadn't seen in years. The wooden toolbox. The one he built when he was 8. The one I thought he'd thrown away or lost in one of his moves. But there it was, scratched and faded, but intact. I opened the door. We didn't speak at first. Just looked at each other. Father and son. Stranger and stranger. Finally, Brandon's voice came out rough and broken. I kept it, he said, holding up the toolbox. Every apartment. Every move. I kept it. I stepped aside. He walked in slowly, like he wasn't sure he was allowed. We sat at the kitchen table. The toolbox between us like a treaty. Mike told me, Brandon started, then stopped. His hands trembled. He told me you worked 80-hour weeks after the divorce. That you ate ramen for dinner so I could have piano lessons. I quit after months. That you drove a truck with a broken heater for 2 winters because my college fund came first. I didn't say anything. Brandon opened the toolbox. Inside were old photographs. Me teaching him to use a level. Me holding him on my shoulders at a Pirates game. Me and him covered in sawdust, grinning. You were right, he whispered. Dylan kicked me out the second the IRS came knocking. Said I was dead weight. Blocked my number. Mom won't return my calls either. I built nothing, Dad. Just lived off you and pretended it was mine. A tear hit the table. I let the silence sit. Then I asked the only question that mattered. Why are you here, Brandon? He looked up. Eyes wet. Voice steady. Because you taught me to build. And I forgot. I'm asking if you'll teach me again. I studied him. This wasn't the entitled kid from the yacht photo. This was someone who'd hit bottom and found it solid. You'll start at the bottom, I said. That I know. 6 am tomorrow. Bring work gloves. His breath caught. You mean it? I don't say things I don't mean, I said. You know that. Brandon nodded. Stood. Extended his hand. I shook it. Firm. The way men do. He left with the toolbox under his arm. I watched him walk down the driveway, disappearing into the dusk. I didn't hug him. Didn't tell him I loved him. Didn't make it easy. Because real love isn't easy. Real love teaches. And tomorrow, lesson 2 would begin. 6 am came cold and gray. I was already in my truck, engine running, coffee in the cup holder, when Brandon appeared at the end of my driveway. He wore old jeans, a faded flannel shirt, and work boots. That looked borrowed. The gloves in his hand were stiff and new. He climbed into the passenger seat without a word. We drove to the site in silence. The radio played low. Classic rock. Tom Petty. The streets were empty except for delivery trucks and early shift workers. Brandon stared out the window. I didn't fill the quiet. When we pulled up to the site, the crew was already gathering. Mike saw us and nodded. Didn't look surprised. I'd called him 2 days ago. This is Brandon, I told the crew. He's starting today. Bottom of the ladder. Treat him like anyone else. No one argued. In construction, everyone starts at the bottom. Even the boss's son. Brandon spent that first day sweeping. Sawdust. Concrete dust. Metal shavings. His hands blistered through the new gloves. I saw him wince, but he didn't stop. Didn't complain. At lunch, he sat apart from the crew, eating a gas station sandwich. Mike sat down next to him. Started talking. By the end of the week, Brandon was sitting with everyone else. Week 4, I taught him the miter saw. His hands shook the first few cuts. Measure twice, cut once, I reminded him. He nodded. Measured 3 times. Week 8, he got his first paycheck. $680. 2 weeks of labor. He stared at it for a long time in the site trailer. Then folded it carefully and put it in his wallet. When he came out, his eyes were wet. Week 12, he moved into a studio apartment in Bloomfield. 400 square feet. Furnished with second-hand stuff from Goodwill. He invited me over. Showed me around like it was a mansion. I stood in the middle of that tiny space and felt prouder than I'd ever felt in his old 3-bedroom house. Week 16, I watched him teach a younger worker how to measure studs. Explaining it slow. Patient. The way I'd taught him. Week 24, he walked up to me during lunch break and handed me an envelope. $500 cash. What's this? I asked. First payment, he said. I owe you $382,000. I'll pay it back. I looked at the money. Then at him. Put it in the toolbox, I said. Keep working. That's payment enough. By month 6, Brandon had changed. His hands were calloused. His shoulders broader. He showed up 15 minutes early every day. Stayed late without being asked. The crew respected him. Not because He was my son. Because he'd earned it. I started letting him run small jobs. Orders. Scheduling. He didn't make many mistakes. And when he did, he fixed them. One morning, I stopped at a diner for breakfast before the site. Opened the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette with my eggs. The headline in the business section stopped my fork midair. Local developer Dylan Shaw W. faces $2.3 million in tax penalties. Subheading, multiple clients file lawsuits. And Peterson Shaw files for divorce, citing financial fraud. I read it twice. Took a sip of coffee. The waitress refilled my cup. Good news? She asked. Justice, I said. Close enough that I left the paper on the table. That afternoon, Brandon and I sat on steel beams during break, 20 feet up, eating sandwiches I'd packed that morning. The city spread out below us. Pittsburgh. The city we were helping rebuild. I called Mom, Brandon said quietly. She didn't answer. Give her time, I said. Dylan moved to Florida, he continued. Dodging lawsuits. Good riddance. Brandon was quiet for a moment. Then, I wasted 10 years worshipping him. Dad. Not wasted, I said. Learned. Big difference. He nodded. Took a bite. Chewed thoughtfully. Think I'll ever own a house again? You will, I said. One you earned. He smiled. First real smile I'd seen in months. Measure twice, cut once. I smiled back. Now you're learning. 2 weeks later, Brandon showed up at my house after work. Said he had something for me. Handed me a small wrapped package. I opened it slowly. Inside was a brass nameplate. Engraved. Peterson and Son Construction. I stared at it. I'm not asking for a partnership, Brandon said quickly. I'm asking for a chance to earn one. 5 years. 10. 20. Whatever it takes. I'll prove it. I set the nameplate on the table between us. Looked at him. Really looked. This wasn't the kid who'd ignored my hospital calls. This was a man who'd fallen and chosen to stand back up. 5 years, I said. Show me. We shook hands. Firm. Equal. He left as the sun set. I stayed on the porch, holding the nameplate, watching his truck, the old used one he'd bought with cash, disappear down the street that I didn't give him a legacy. I made him build one. And that's what real fathers do. Here's what I learned. Love without boundaries isn't love. It's enabling. For 30 years, I thought being a good father meant catching my son every time he stumbled. Buying the house. Covering the rent. Writing the checks. But I wasn't building him up. I was keeping him down. The hardest thing I ever did wasn't taking back that house or that car. It was letting Brandon hit the ground. Watching him struggle. Knowing I could fix it with one phone call and choosing not to. That's the lesson. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step back and let consequences teach what your words never could. If you're watching this and you've got kids or grandkids who take more than they give, who've forgotten where they came from, who think the world owes them something, hear me. You're not helping them. By keeping the safety net so tight they never learn to walk on their own. Real love is tough. Real legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you teach them to build themselves. Measure twice. Cut once. That goes for life too. If this story hit home, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment telling me your story. Have you had to make a tough call with family? Did you learn it the hard way like Brandon? Or each it the hard way like me? I read every single comment. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it. Maybe it'll save them 30 years of mistakes. Like I said at the start. You find out who loves you when you're lying in that hospital bed. But sometimes, you find out who you really are when you get back up. Thanks for listening. I'm Frank Peterson. And this is my story.